A lab in Israel is reviving the dead, and the most shocking part is that it isn't clickbait. Stay with me, because the twist at the end turns an astonishing scientific breakthrough into something far bigger, older, and more hopeful than anyone expected. We're not just talking about a plant coming back to life after 1,000 years. We're stepping into a story that stretches from King Solomon's court to cutting-edge biotechnology. From the incense of the ancient temple to the prophecies about the resurrection of the dead. And yes, the way it's happening is eerily similar to how the prophets said it would. It begins, surprisingly, with the Queen of Sheba. Imagine the 10th century BCE, the desert heat rippling over caravan lines, camels laden with gold, rare woods, and exotic resins. The queen arrives in Jerusalem to test Solomon's wisdom, and among the treasures she brings are spices and a fabled aromatic resin the ancients revered, the Balm of Gilead, also called the balsam of Judea. Josephus, the Jewish historian writing under Rome, spoke of it in almost reverent tones. It was medicine and perfume, healing and holiness, distilled from a plant said to grow in oases near the Dead Sea. Over centuries, this legendary plant vanished from cultivation. By the 9th century of the Common Era, it had seemingly disappeared from the world's gardens and markets, surviving only in texts and memories. Until now, a researcher in Jerusalem received a small cache of ancient seeds, dry, silent, more than 1,000 years old, recovered by Israeli archaeological teams and preserved like tiny time capsules. She didn't know exactly which species they were, but she tried something that, on paper, sounded like a respectful whisper to the past. She rinsed them, warmed them, and then fed them a carefully prepared brew of water, nutrients, and mild acids designed to coax dormant life. This was not a single attempt. It was a patient, methodical series of treatments, a ritual of care and chemistry. Then, the impossible happened. The seeds woke up. After a millennium asleep, shoots broke the soil, leaves unfurled, vines stretched, green and insistent, like a memory remembering itself. The results surfaced publicly only recently, late in 2024, though the work began years earlier, around 2010. The team waited, checked and rechecked, sharing data with select colleagues abroad, at institutions including a lab in Zurich, before saying aloud what their eyes already knew. The plant they've nicknamed Sheba is what many believe to be the very balsam that had vanished, the balm of Judea reborn. Ancient writers like Pliny the Elder didn't describe it as a simple shrub. He wrote of something more vine-like, draping and climbing, a living thread through the hot air of desert gardens. That's precisely what this revived plant resembles. Its fragrance is striking, medicinal and sweet, the kind of scent that lingers in the air and in your memory. If this identification holds, it's as if someone has reopened a long-sealed jar from the first temple storerooms and set the room breathing again. And this carries a deeper echo. One of the 11 ingredients of the incense used in the tabernacle and later in Solomon's temple was a mysterious substance preserved in scripture and tradition. Scholars have argued for centuries over the exact recipe, but many associate the lost balsam with those sacred blends. If so, then what's sprouting in this lab isn't just a botanical curiosity. It's a key to a ritual scent the world hasn't truly inhaled in 1,000 years. The idea that God would allow humanity to rediscover the ancient incense precisely now feels less like coincidence and more like choreography. But that's only the first resurrection. Near Masada, the desert fortress where Jewish rebels faced Roman legions in an act of defiant faith, archaeologists uncovered another set of ancient seeds. They were date palms, the famed Judean dates that Roman authors raved about, large, sweet, and subtly reminiscent of wine. Those historical descriptions don't perfectly match the modern varieties cultivated in Israel today, impressive as they are. So what exactly did the old fruit taste like? How large? How lush? To find out, researchers sent several seeds to an overseas lab for carbon dating. The results were jaw-dropping, approximately 2,000 years old. You can picture the stillness in the lab as they began the same process. Warm water to soften the seed coat, a nutrient solution to signal life, carefully balanced acidity to whisper, "wake." Then, in a humble pot, a green spear appeared above the soil. It kept rising, slow, steady, faithful to an ancient blueprint. The team nicknamed the first survivor Methuselah. Fitting, because just as the biblical Methuselah lived longer than any man, this seed had outlasted empires. It turned out to be male. Later, a female from another ancient seed line was brought to maturity, and pollination followed. The fruit that resulted was different, larger, more succulent, with a unique flavor profile that older texts had hinted at. Imagine biting into time. 2 stories, 2 resurrections, the desert of Judea yielding lost life, life that should have decayed into silence long ago. At this point, the skeptic asks a fair question. Isn't this just clever horticulture and good luck? And the believer asks an even more pointed one. Is this a whisper of something bigger? Because what the prophets say about the future looks strangely like what these labs are doing to seeds. Isaiah writes, "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. Awake and sing, you who dwell in the dust, for your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead." Daniel adds, "Many who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." And Ezekiel, in his vision of the valley of dry bones, watches lifeless skeletons knit into human forms as breath enters them, and they stand again, a living nation born out of ruins. Don't rush past that word, dew. In Jewish tradition, that dew is a metaphor for a subtle but irresistible life force, a divine condensation that settles on what looks dead and coaxes it awake. The sages in the Talmud offered a startling detail. They taught that resurrection would flow from a tiny, indestructible bone called the lus, at the base of the human skull or at the spine. From that core, the body would be rebuilt, part by part, like a reverse unraveling of decay. Now, step back and look at the lab bench. Ancient seeds, long past their expected viability, are bathed in warmth, water, nutrients, and gentle acids that imitate the natural signals a seed would encounter in its rightful season. Dew in a beaker. The dead, persuaded to live again. Not a spectacle of lightning from the sky, not a thunderous miracle that violates nature, but a miracle that rides on nature. The way a musician plays a violin that's been silent in an attic for centuries. Here is where one modern sage enters the story. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, brilliant, curious, and deeply engaged with science, once suggested a provocative idea. He argued that the resurrection of the dead could, in part, come through human partnership with God's laws of nature. That technology might be one of the tools providence uses. He even pointed toward cloning and the recovery of genetic material from bones as a possible path. Applying water, nutrients, yes, even acids, to rebuild what once was, under divine guidance. At the time, it sounded like a distant speculation. Today, it sounds less like fantasy and more like the next chapter of what we're watching with our own eyes. Pause for a heartbeat and consider this. If God prefers to move the world toward redemption by degrees, subtle step after subtle step, wouldn't it make sense to start with seeds? Seeds are packaged resurrection. Burial and rebirth are in their design. If dormant plant life can wake after 1,000 or 2,000 years, it breaks something inside our certainty about the finality of death. It tells us, don't be so sure the story's over, not when the author is still writing. Quick question for you, because I want to hear what you think. Are these revived plants just remarkable scientific feats, or do you see them as early signposts of something larger? Perhaps even the first notes of a song the prophets promised we would one day hear? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if explorations like this speak to you, hit like so more people see it, and consider subscribing. There's a lot more coming where we connect ancient texts, living science, and the mysteries unfolding right now. Back to the thread. Think about the speed of our age. A century ago, no one seriously believed we'd walk on the moon. A few decades ago, the idea that an AI could write, speak, and analyze would have sounded like wizardry. Now we talk openly about private missions to the moon and Mars. We edit genes, grow tissues in labs, 3D print organs, and resurrect the lineages of extinct plants. Every few months, a headline arrives that would have shattered the limits of yesterday's science. So when the tradition whispers that resurrection will happen, some to everlasting life and others to a less welcome fate, it's not crazy to imagine that the threshold events might look like what we're seeing. The ancient world, quietly waking up in green, in blossom, in fruit. Pliny described Judean dates that were 3 times the size of ordinary ones and tasted faintly of wine. He wasn't writing poetry, he was making a record. Today, fruit from revived date palms matches that profile in uncanny ways. Josephus and other writers exulted over the balm from the Dead Sea's garden oases, a plant we thought was gone. And here it is, unfurling leaves under the same sun, whispering the same scent. If the next steps are the revival of lost animals, species slumbering in ancient DNA, and then, only when the world is ready, human restoration, that would be perfectly in line with a God who prefers to weave miracles into the fabric he made, not tear it. The point is not to sensationalize or to claim that we're standing on the threshold of the final resurrection this very second. The point is to notice patterns. Biblical prophecy often reveals the destination. Science, providentially guided, may be building the road. The Talmudic image of the lust bone is not a biology lesson. It's a map of hope. From an indestructible core, life can be rebuilt. The lab method, coaxing from dormancy with warmth and dew-like solutions, mirrors that map almost too neatly to ignore. And that brings us back to where this began. A lab in Israel, a handful of ancient seeds, and a plant the world forgot. On one level, this is botany. On another, it is the return of a lost letter in a sentence written across millennia. When Isaiah says the earth will bring forth the dead, he uses the language of soil and seeds. When Ezekiel watches bones knit back into living bodies, he witnesses an anatomy of hope. The desert of Judea has always been a paradox, a place of barrenness that births revelation. It's where prophets heard whispers that changed history. Today, that same desert is sprouting memory. So here is the promise and the caution. We should neither panic nor fall asleep. We should learn, test, measure, and still leave room for wonder. We should be humble enough to admit that the world is stranger and kinder than we think, and that God's timing is better than our own. If these resurrections of plants are a preface, then the story ahead is one of restoration. Not apocalypse in the sense of collapse, but apocalypse in its true meaning, unveiling. The world unveiling what it has kept safe in its dust for millennia. The author unveiling a chapter he wrote long ago. Seeds sleeping for 2,000 years do not rise for nothing. They rise to remind us what is possible. They rise to tell us that nothing entrusted to the earth is ever truly lost. Not if the one who made it still speaks the word, live.